Hello. So today we are going to discuss a little bit about the Django REST framework permissions, which is basically a way to determine if a given user can access an endpoint. So use it to grant or deny the access based on some information that we can retrieve from the request. And after the user is authenticated, we can look for further permissions based on the logic of your application. And basically we have two ways of adding the permissions to our views. One is adding this to the REST framework configuration. So this is like a global permission policy. So you can list here, for example, that all your endpoints are going to use the isAuthenticated permission. And the other way, which is the way that we have been using so far, is adding the permission directly to our views. So if we check here, for example, the transaction report requires the user to be authenticated, the list of transactions as well, the category, and the currency is the only one that we didn't set any permission. So any user can consume this endpoint, and it's a read-only endpoint because it's just listing the data. So we don't allow anyone to modify the contents. And here on our settings file, we don't have any configuration added because this is falling back to the default, which is the allow any. And maybe the first thing that we can do here is to modify this behavior, because one thing that you have to keep in mind is which permission strategy is going to be the most used on your endpoints. For example, this API that we are developing here requires a user to be logged in to consume most of the endpoints. So it doesn't make much sense to set this here over and over again. So maybe the proper strategy would be to set the isAuthenticated policy as a global one, and then we just pick those that doesn't require authentication. So we have here on Postman, for example, let's first log in here. So we are logging with the user Vitor. Then we can list his transactions here. So we are using the access token to authenticate. And then for the list currencies, we don't have any access token here, so anyone can go here and consume this endpoint. So let's change the way that we are doing here so far. So let's just grab this code and apply here. Okay, so now all our endpoints have the isAuthenticated policy here. And then if we try to list the currencies, you're going to get this error now, because then we are not passing any authentication here. And then to fix that, on the view, we can add here permission classes, allow any. So this one here we import from the REST framework permissions. And if we look at the implementation, this is just returning true here. So it's not really mandatory to have the permission here, because another way that we can do to allow any is just passing an empty list. So it's going to work on the same way. But I also like to use the allow any, so it's more explicit what the endpoint is doing. And then now we can remove the isAuthenticated permission class from this endpoint, for example, which is this one here. So we no longer need this. Okay. And then if we remove the access token and try again, so it's falling back to the default policy. And then we can remove the unnecessary code now. So all our views here that had this permission class no longer need it. Okay, it's much better now. And something that we can do now is to change a little bit this currency list. For example, let's say we want to allow any user to list the currencies, but we also want to provide an endpoint to create new currencies to the application, but this user must be authenticated, for example. So first thing, let's just switch here and say this is a view set now, so we can expose the other endpoint. So just a recap here on the model view set, we have an endpoint to create, retrieve, update, delete, and list, so all the basic operations here. And now we have to change how this view set is going to expose the URLs, because this is no longer a class-based view. So we remove here the old definition and we register here as currencies and set a base name, currency. And now this the list currencies should behave the same way. Okay. And now we are going to have the endpoint to post and create a new currency. So let's create a folder here so we can better organize currencies. Now let's just move the policy here, the endpoint, I mean. And then let's just make this one here, create currency. It's going to be a post request. And now we have to pass here the data. So let's check the serializer. So currency. Then we are using the currency serializer that we defined in previous videos. Then we must pass a code and a name, and the ID is a read-only field. So we should pass here code and the code of the currency and the name. Okay, and then let's just get here a list of currencies so we can have a few examples. So let's grab this one here and add the name and the code AFN. So now you can see that anyone can create, so I'm passing no authentication here. And then the REST framework has this permission which is authenticated or read-only. So let's have a look here. And then instead of allow any, we are using this permission class. And if we have a look on the definition of this permission class, you can see here that the request must be in the list of safe methods, which is get, head, and options. Okay, or the user must be authenticated. So effectively what that means is that the retrieve and the list view is going to be available for anyone, but if the user wants to create, update, or delete, the user must be authenticated. So let's see here the list currency. So it still works. Then let's grab a new currency here on Wikipedia. And then ALL. Let's see. So now these require credentials to create a new instance on the database. And we can change here and add the access token to the header. And we can try again. And then the currency is created here with success. And now let's say we want to modify, because we want to preserve this behavior, like list and retrieve anyone can do, but then to create a currency, we want the user to be a staff to be able to create or modify, because we don't want anyone who has an account and is logged in to be able to modify this instance, because maybe we are using this on a global level and we need some to control this access here. And we can see here that we don't really have a permission that does that out of the box, because the is authenticator or read only doesn't check if the user is an admin or not. So here what we can do is make a custom permission based on this one. So we can define here inside the app a new permissions module, and then I'm going to call that is admin or read only. And then all the custom permissions should subclass this base permission, which is defined inside the REST framework permissions. And then maybe we can just grab the code here and add this new check. We need to import the safe methods. It's a constant that is defined inside the permissions file here. And then we can add here a new check, request.user.isStaff. Okay. And then we change here the permission. Then I'm importing this one here from the file that we just created, right? So it's this one here. And now before we test, let's just change the user's flag here. Let's use the Maria user. Let's see if she's a staff. Yeah, so let's turn off this flag and just make sure super user. Okay, then let's just check our other user here. Staff. Okay, so Vitor is a staff and Maria is not a staff. And now let's try to log in here with Maria first. Okay, let's see if the list currencies is working. Okay, now let's try to create a new currency. Let's grab a new one, British pound. Okay, so now you can see that we passed the access token, so the user authenticated, but then later on we got a 403 status error, which is a forbidden. The user doesn't have the permission to perform the create action here. But then if we change to the other user, which is a staff, now we can create. Okay. So that's basically how you create a custom permission. So you can do anything inside here. You can access some query set here. You can play around with this method. And then all it have to do is to return a Boolean at the end of the day. So if it's returning true or false, to grant or deny the access. And another cool permission that we have here is the Django model permissions. This one is based on the Django permission framework, which is mainly used on the Django admin to grant access to a given model. So You can add a permission or remove, so the user can create an instance of category or transaction and so on. And yeah, let's try it here on the category model. Let's say we want to define, based on the Django permissions framework, that this user must have the can create or can delete or can update. And if we look here on the implementation, you see that we have this permission map. So for all the safe methods like get, options, and head, the user doesn't need any specific permission. But then for the post, to create a new instance, the user must have the add permission, put and patch must have the change permission, and delete, the user must have the delete permission. And then you can see that we have this flag here, which is to translate the permission as the user must be always authenticated to use the endpoint, but then doesn't require any specific permission to use those methods. And nowadays Django has a permission that looks something like that. Just modifying here the source code. I'm not going to save, just so I can show you. But nowadays we have the view permission, but then this is a new permission that I think it was introduced on the version 2.0, but I can't recall for sure. So, but then the REST framework still has the old behavior here, which is not having any permission at all. But anyway, if you want to enforce having the view permission, you can make a copy of this class here and implement your own, and then you just import from your application there. So all we need to do here is add these Django model permissions, and then we can test here first, logging with Maria. Okay. Now let's try to list her categories. Okay. Now let's try to create a new category here. So you see that she doesn't have the Django permission. So we can try to import that. Permission. Let's just check all the permissions that we have on the database. I'm going to print here the ID and the permission. So those here, they're all the default permissions that we have with Django. And whenever you add a new model and you create the first migration, Django is automatically going to create these 4 permissions here, which is the add, change, delete, and view. So basically we have this permission 25, which is the can add category. So let's retrieve this one here. Okay. Now let's get the user Maria. User permissions, not all. So she doesn't have any permission at all. Let's add here permission P. Okay, so now she can add categories. So let's see if this works. Okay. So now we can add new categories to the database here, right? And then, for example, because the Vitor user is staff, but he's also a super user, he doesn't need to be assigned any permissions there. So we can pretty much create a new instance here. So, but then if we change the flag, and then we let the user be a staff, but then he's not a super user anymore. So this flag here just tells Django that this user doesn't need to be assigned any permissions. So he has all the permissions available. But then because I turned off this flag, so now even though I'm a staff, I need to have this permission assigned. Okay. And then, yeah, and another thing to know here is about how you compose the permissions. For example, they have this nice example here about creating a block list based on the IP address of the user. So you can have this additional module here, and the user must be making the request from a given IP address to be able to access the endpoint. And let's try to do something similar here. For example, we can create a new module. I'll do the other way around. I'll create an allow list. Just add here the IP address. I think there is an yes, there is a field here. Let's create this module now. Generic IP address. Okay. Using the wrong one here. Generic IP address. Okay. Now let's say we want to create a permission that the user must be making the request based on a list of IP address that we allow to consume the endpoint. So let's maybe grab here the same code. And then we change this to allow list permission. And then we grab here from the request metadata, the remote address. Then this is something that you have to pay attention to, because usually we use Django and Django REST framework behind the proxy server. So you need to make sure that this web server that is receiving the request is passing along the correct IP address to the Django application usually using GUnicorn, and but you need to make sure when you put that in production that this information is passed along to this header. Sometimes you have this on the forward address, so this is just a technicality on how this information is going to reach your application here. But anyway, let's change this here to allow it. And then allow list object. I'm going to import this one from core. Okay. And so we're retrieving here from the request the IP address. We check if this IP address is on the database, and then we return. This is going to return true or false if the value is there or not. But then here we have to fix the name of the field, because I created this as IP address. Okay. So now we can make a composition here of, let's say, on the category. To create categories, the user must have the permission based on the Django model. And then we can have here the bitwise comparison, and the user must have the IP address on the allow list. So let's see now. Let's log in with Maria, which is the one that we assigned the permission here. And then, for example, we are no longer going to be able to, oops, let's see here. Let's see there. List permission. Okay. I think we can only put it like that. We don't need the end here. Okay, let's try again. Okay, so we no longer have access to list here the information, but then we can try to add a new IP address here. Django.allow list. And let's add our local IP address. Okay. So now we can list again the information, right? Also create. And then another way that we can change this permission is instead of, so this, the end here, the problem, I think it was the comma here, because then this was a single operation. Let's try again. Yeah. And list and create. Okay. And then, for example, let's say that I want to change this as something like that. The user must have the Django model permission or be in the allowed list of IP addresses. So we can change this to a pipe. So this is going to be an OR. And let's check here our user. So user permissions. So we can see here that we have the add category, but we can clear here all the permissions. Okay. So we no longer have the permission to add the category. But then let's log in with her again. Let's just close a few of those endpoints. Okay, let's try again the create. We can create now, even though we don't have the permission, but we are falling here to the permission class. If we remove the IP address, so now we don't have the permission, and we are not in the IP address list. So now we are denied the permission. So that's a way to compose. And then you can, I try to avoid making very complex operations here. So I never add more than 2 or 3 permissions like that. If the permission is too complex, I prefer to create a custom permission and add the logic inside here, the has permission method. But this here, yeah. But then if you have a good way of reusing the logic that you implemented, then you can play around with those composition here. So you basically have the and or not. So you can use that here in the permissions definition. And yeah, there is more to it. You can also have the Django object permission that you can check if a given user has permission to modify a given instance of a model. And but all those things you have to code by yourself, depending on what is the criteria to allow or to deny the access. And usually it's very difficult to check the object permission when you're listing the data, because for example here on the list currency we have just a few currencies here, but then let's say this endpoint could be listing like on the transactions. This one only has 9, but then our other user here have over 1000 transactions, and then to check the permissions for each of those instances here on the list view may be very expensive to do so. So usually what we do to protect list endpoints is to create a filter that retrieve only the data the user can act on. So yeah, that's usually how I do that. But anyway, that's just an overview of the Django REST framework permissions. And you can build on top of that, just following those examples here that we created based on the base permission and just adding here the has permission method. So that's all for now, and I'll see you on the next video. Bye bye.